Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Hamilton Report. I'm Scott J. Hamilton, and I'm very happy that you are going to spend half an hour with us this evening. We have a very timely show for you tonight. Before we get into tonight's show, a couple of things from last week. You may recall that Toby Jenkins was our guest on last week's program, talking about the vote before the Tulsa City Council on whether or not to include LGBTQ plus people in their hate crimes ordinance. And I'm happy to tell you that successfully passed, and the City Council did vote to include that portion of the community. So that's good news. Also, I want to say that last week, in my appeal to you for your financial support, I may have been a bit overzealous, and I apologize for that because I did not mean to leave anyone out when I was giving suggested donation amounts. So if I offended you, please, I'm very sorry about that. And do know that every dollar, every nickel that we receive as support for the Oklahoma Democratic Party helps us to make sure to elect more Dems in Oklahoma. So thank you as always for your support. I greatly appreciate that. Tonight, we are going to be looking at what it means now that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is no longer with us, specifically in terms of what it means for women's health and reproductive rights. Before I introduce my guest, though, I'm going to ask you to join me for just a moment of silence as we remember all of the contributions made to our country by Justice Ginsburg. Thank you. My guest this evening is someone that I've had the pleasure of working with for nearly a dozen years now. We've served together in speaking at rallies, protests. We've met each other in the halls of the Capitol, and we've had a chance to work together, to know each other, and it's really been a privilege for me. I first met our guest when she was working for the ACLU, and now she's working for Planned Parenthood, Great Plains based here in Oklahoma City. And it's my privilege to welcome to the Hamilton Report my guest tonight, Tamya CoxToure. Tamya, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I think that we all knew that Justice Ginsburg was not well, but we certainly all held out hope and prayer that she would make it through this election because there's so very much riding on it. When I knew you were going to be our guest tonight, I posted something to the effect that never have the stakes been higher for women's health and reproductive rights. Sadly, I was mistaken because they're even higher today than they were this time last week. So with that being said, where do we stand right now as a nation with regard to women's health, with access to abortion, with the right to choose, and what's at stake now if the Republicans nominate and select a new Supreme Court justice?
For sure. Well, one, thanks again for having me. I think that's a great question. For those, I'm Tamya CoxToure, and I serve as the Regional Director of Public Policy and Organizing for Planned Parenthood Great Plains and Great Plains Votes, which is our C4 arm, or advocacy arm. And my pronouns are she, hers. I think that's a great question, but I think what's important to know is that what's at stake has been what's at stake for a very long time, specifically in Oklahoma. Access to reproductive health care in Oklahoma and even around our region has been severely limited because of very conservative anti-choice legislators. It's unfortunate, but what we have learned is that the courts, whether the district courts, the state courts, the federal and appellate courts, they have been the backstops for this very harmful legislation for so long. And we don't believe, and fundamental rights should never be based on, in the arms or, threatened by one person. And that's what part of the passing of Justice Ginsburg exposes. But, ultimately bringing love and light to her family who are in mourning, immediately when heard the news, of course, a lot of us political wonks went straight to, what does that mean? How does that change anything? Instead of standing back and settling into the fact that this is a justice who gave, her adult career life to trying and doing her best to, at times, to provide additional rights to others. I also think it's important that even in the passing, that we hold Justice Ginsburg accountable for some of her, the way that she decided some cases that really harmed specifically Native American communities. I don't think it goes without saying. And that is actually something that just I learned even recently, just this weekend, about some of her decisions and the harm that caused. So I think that it's really important that we recognize that folks are not perfect by any means and should be held accountable when they can be. But we also recognize the amazing work that she has done for voting rights and LGBTQ issues, and specifically for me personally, as for women's health issues. I'm a former ACLU lawyer, and as we know, Justice Ginsburg founded our women's project at the ACLU. So definitely have a lot of respect for her. So going back to your question, what's at stake for reproductive health and rights in Oklahoma has been what's at stake for such a very long time.
I read a statistic over the weekend, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I took from this article, only 28% of Americans are in favor of reversing Roe versus Wade. Is that correct?
That is correct. We've seen an increase that folks do not want Roe v. Wade overturned.
So here we have 28% of the people who would favor that. The rest of America does not. And yet this continues to be a hot button issue. It's almost like waving a red flag in front of a bull that they trot out every time.
Right.
So how is it that with only 28% of the people in support that they're able to gain this much leverage with that kind of thinking? And it doesn't compute for me.
For sure. So one thing, I think it's a few things. First off is that we know that our legislature is not representative necessarily of the community. So while we believe that overwhelming number of Oklahomans actually are in favor of not overturning Roe v. Wade, we also know that that's just not the case at the legislature. The second thing I just want to note is that even though we still have Roe v. Wade, there are many people who still live in abortion deserts, who still don't have access to abortion care, reproductive health care, and in a lot of terms, just OBGYN care. So this is a reality of what it looks like when Roe is overturned. A lot of people in the United States are already facing that. I think that's just important to say. But again, we have a very conservative Oklahoma legislature that continues to play politics over people. And that is the concerning part. Again, I've been doing this work for over 12 years. And while we've seen an increase as far as of more pro-reproductive health, sexual reproductive health champions have been elected, we know that every year we're going to have an abortion bill, an anti-abortion bill. What we do know is that Planned Parenthood Great Plains Votes, as well as other organizations, consistently try to expose why these bills are bad, why these bills do not decrease the number of abortions, why these bills are actually dangerous and harmful to Oklahomans. So what we have to do as a community is come together and say no more. We expect more. We expect better. And especially in a state as Oklahoma, where health outcomes are already poor, why are we not, right, for everyone, why are we not exposing that part of it? Why are we focusing so much on the personal decisions of pregnant people? And And why is that, why is that not being centered?
Tamya,
Mhm.
I saw this, you just brought up something that made me think of something that I saw a few weeks ago. There was a group of people with signs about not wearing masks and how it was all a hoax and so forth. And I saw this one guy who looked like me. He was a white middle-aged man carrying a sign that said, "It's my body and you can't tell me what to do with it."
Mhm. Right.
And I thought, you don't even understand the irony of what you're saying.
Right. So our language, right? Those that truly believe that bodily autonomy is extremely important, our language has been co-opted by a group. And regardless of how they feel, they are co-opting that language that we feel so strongly about. Except for we believe our views our mission and our views are really based in science and evidence, whereas not wearing masks and masks, not helping are not.
So if that's the kind of co-opting that's happening, and we know that it is, how do you break through the clutter
Mhm.
and explain the absolute importance, Tamya,
Mhm.
of women's health? That's got to be a big challenge every day for you.
It's a challenge, but I would argue that the challenge is not necessarily with the legislators. Again, doing this work for as long as we've both been doing, it is easy to go up to that place on 23rd and Lincoln and talk to legislators and feel the monotony or sometimes the hostility towards what we do. But the challenge is actually finding ways to destigmatize abortion in the everyday lives of people. So when I am talking to people in our community, really try to, normalize abortion as much as we can. And I would even say normalize women's healthcare or normalize healthcare as much as we can, because that's where change happens. Change, I vehemently believe that, or I adamantly believe that change happens around the kitchen tables. Change happens when we're talking to a few people that we trust and believe in, and they change their views that are probably going to change someone else's views. As someone who, we have term limits in Oklahoma, so consistently and constantly having to re-educate legislators about certain stuff, that's just going to happen. But when we can re-educate and talk to the communities and individuals about why it's so important that when we talk about Black Lives Matter, that when we talk about environmental justice, that when we talk about all of these things, that reproductive justice and reproductive rights is very much centered in all those conversations.
And I'm glad you said that. We had an event today with Tom Steyer. He was a candidate for president, and now he is focusing his entire energy and great sums of money on correcting the changes within our environment that are so destructive. And he said something today that I found fascinating. He said if you take 18 to 35-year-olds in every state in the country, every state would be a blue state.
Mm-hmm.
Because younger people are thinking much more progressively now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited about that. Of course, we've got to get everyone out to vote, naturally. But you also said something that I think is important. We cannot legislate a change of heart. That has to take place, like you said, around the kitchen table, one person at a time.
Yeah.
Now, I make myself a promise every day that I will not read the comments on local news sites. Every day I break that promise to myself. And I don't know if I'm just being a glutton for punishment or what. But in reading some of the comments this weekend after the passing of Justice Ginsburg, it broke my heart. Things like, now she's burning in hell for all the children she killed. And now God's going to get her. I mean, this kind of thinking, how do we stop that cycle, Tamya, so that we can have real conversations as opposed to continuing the same rhetoric?
The reality is, I don't know that answer, right? I don't know how to stop that. But what I do know is that in my work and then in PPGPV Votes work, is that we will never focus on that aspect. those will not be the people that we are trying to talk to or discuss or change minds and hearts. What I will talk about are those that are really struggling with this idea of, when is it okay for politicians to interfere with the personal decision-making process? Because we can have this conversation back and forth, but ultimately, when it comes to abortion rights, for me, the fundamental question is, are you okay with the government making personal decisions for you? And if that answer is yes, then I can see how you could go. But for me and mine and those that I'm close to, that answer is always no. And that's where we need to focus our energy. I can't give negative energy. Like, I can't give any energy to those negative comments and the violent comments, because they're gonna be there. But what I can give energy is to those that are really trying to learn and understand better about how this decision-making process works.
That's a very mature way of thinking. And I should have called you over the weekend because I needed some mature guidance on that. I can't think of a single area of life where Americans would say, yes, I'm here. I think that the government absolutely should interfere with my decision making. So this is the only place.
Right. And it goes back to, I think we have to talk about patriarchy when we talk about racism and when we talk about these issues. And if we are not fighting, and ultimately, I really look at all these issues as bodily autonomy, right? That ultimately, I look at all these issues as like ending oppression. And that's what we should be all fighting for. We should all be fighting for liberation. And we can't have liberation if we don't have rights over our own bodies. And that's what I think we should be talking about, whether it's LGBT rights, whether it's racial equity. It is about ending oppression. It's about why are we not allowed to have full rights over our own bodies? And that's the question that, I ask very conservative legislators all the time about.
You made a very pointed observation there that I think it's easy for us to build little silos and talk about reproductive rights and talk about LGBTQ issues and Black Lives Matter, when in fact they're all pieces of the same, aren't they?
They're all connected, and ultimately that's what reproductive justice is, knowing that we don't, the intersectionality of it all is that we don't live these very one-lane lives. So, if for me, and as I said earlier, it's about fighting for liberation, and that's what we all should be, regardless of where you are. We all should be fighting for liberation every day, every breath we take, and I think we get to a better spot when we acknowledge that.
Well, that's a profound statement, and I'm glad that you shared that. In looking at the near term, particularly this presidential election, there are many things riding on it, of course, and this is one issue that I think is critically important because it will, I think, ramp up, the rhetoric will ramp up closer to the first week in November, and let me ask you to help our viewers out, what advice can you give people like me, ordinary folks who want to be an effective supporter of women's reproductive rights, who want to help amplify your message? What do we do?
Right. So I think the first thing is to show up. And showing up doesn't necessarily mean for Planned Parenthood, but showing up for coalition groups. We have a great reproductive justice coalition, Oklahoma Call for Reproductive Justice. We have great abortion funds. And, I'm speaking about abortion, but that could be very much talking about women's health specifically. I think showing up is important. I think just being vulnerable and just saying, how can I help, and talking to people. I don't, being vulnerable and saying, I just don't have all the answers. I just know that this is not right. And having those conversations. We, in our electoral program, currently, we've endorsed about 22 candidates here in Oklahoma. And in that, we really talk about we Planned Parenthood nationally has actually one of the largest electoral programs in the country, spending millions and millions of dollars to ensure that champions are being elected all the way down the ballot. But what we've learned is that it is not enough for me as a Planned Parenthood representative to go out and talk to voters about why they should vote for A, B, C, and D. But what is important is that a supporter that I know asking them, hey, can you talk to 5 of your friends? Hey, can you ensure that your family are aware of the issues going on? Can you make sure that they're voting and they have a voting plan and they know what to do on, election day or early voting or how to vote by mail? So we call that relational organizing. And we believe that tactic is something that most of we come from an organizing background, Scott. So we know that's how you do it, but we've professionalized it in some way and called it relational organizing now. And we know that's what's effective. People want to hear from people they trust, and that trusted person typically is someone that's in their network.
And I think that that's really good advice. And I know that it can be hard, especially in Oklahoma, where families are not looking forward to Thanksgiving this year, and it has nothing to do with COVID. It's all about right versus left, progressive versus conservative. And so those conversations are difficult. And I just need to acknowledge that for our viewers, that this is not easy stuff to talk about.
No.
If we don't, what are we risking if we are not bold enough to make a statement, even to those whose minds we may never change, but at least they need to know what it is we're thinking, what it is we feel, and what it is we support.
I think what's at stake, or what we risk, is what we're seeing in our country right now with the racism and the misogyny, anti-queerness. That's what's at risk. And so I get it. I definitely get that these are difficult conversations to have, and people need to create their boundaries and know when it is. But I also want to, just for those that have to deal with that toxicity, also just give you the permission, not that you need it, is that you can walk away at any time, and you should be in a position to walk away from toxicity, because your life, you deserve much better than that. So knowing kind of the boundaries of how you can have those conversations is important, but knowing that as adults, we also get to just walk away and be with family that we want to be around, be with people that we want to be with, and we can create our own families if it's that important to you. But I understand those conversations are hard, but difficult conversations have to happen if we want to move forward in this country.
That's certainly well stated. Once we move past November, it's just a really quick jump into the Oklahoma legislative season. And like you said, there's always going to be an abortion bill. There's always going to be some kind of an anti-LGBTQ bill. Any word on what we may be looking at in February?
No, I think that's a great point. And again, it's the policy in me is that I chair one of our national committees in our Planned Parenthood family, where I serve as kind of the liaison between our national office and our affiliates across the country. So in all 50 of our states, and we come together for our public affairs staff. And one of the things we wanted to make sure is that for a lot of red states, and I should back up. So Planned Parenthood Great Plains is a 4-state affiliate. So we have health centers in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. And I get to oversee our public affairs staff in Arkansas and Oklahoma. So I get very much knowledge of very conservative, deep-rooted red states. And I say that to say is that one of their biggest concerns is that we have to be concerned about the backlash. If Democrats get the trifecta, where they get the House, the Senate, and the presidency, we know that the backlash at these very conservative states, and I would say very conservative states, but these red states, will be through the legislation. And so our job is really to anticipate and scenario plan all options. Is if Biden wins, what does that mean for Oklahomans? And the truth is, what it means for Oklahomans, is that we could potentially see additional harmful bills around healthcare. We could see harmful bills just around race equity, and what are we willing to do? So we have to look through this electoral program or this electoral world through a legislative lens. And so it's not one thing, or it's not one or the other. It's both at the same time. And it's very difficult for a lot of us and a lot of people that are just thinking electorally, because a lot of us have to think, okay, what does that mean for sessions? And how are we going to fight at sessions? And so November 3rd, I want to say November 3rd, because I think the reality is we won't, in my opinion, we won't have an announced presidency maybe a week later. So when we do have an announcement, regardless if it's a President Trump or a Joe Biden, what do we do next? And so we don't get to rest. We don't get to rest. The rest of the session is over, and that's okay. That's what the work is about. So, and that's what I just encourage those that are watching, is that we don't have an end date on this fight. We don't have an end date on the work. And that's okay. But what we do know is that we can scenario plan, we can come together. And I would say that's the most important thing. All of us that truly believe in this work, all coming together to focus on one area. I think, again, that's how we move Oklahoma forward. And I think that has to be one of the ultimate goals as well.
Tamya, you have given us so much to think about tonight. And I'm really, as always, I'm grateful to work with you, and I'm grateful that you spent some time with us this evening. I'm going to ask that you will commit to joining us again in the next few months to let us know what you're doing, and let us know how we can help, because this is one of the issues that we all have to rally around. And so I'm deeply appreciative of all that you do and all that the good folks at Planned Parenthood do. And do come back and see us again soon. You promise?
I do. And I just want to end with how I end most of it, is my favorite quote from Alice Walker, which is, "Activism is my rent to live on this planet." And so I just end that with that. And thank you so much for having me.
We'll talk real soon. Thanks, Tamya. This is an issue that is important to all people, whether we recognize it or not, because women's health impacts more than half of the people on the planet. It's what we allow to happen or not happen that will make a difference in the lives of women today and women in the next generation. So I encourage you, as you go to vote in these next few weeks, to keep this and other issues in mind that are deeply important to you. Because the way that we make change is by voting for change, and then demanding that our public servants truly keep in mind that they work for us, and that what we say has to matter in Oklahoma, in Washington, and around the country. I'm very grateful that you spent some time with us this evening. My guest next week will be joining me talking about the challenges of political reporting, fairly reporting on politics in Oklahoma. Phil Cross, former investigative journalist for KOKH, Fox 25 in Oklahoma City, will be my guest. And until then, I hope that you take good care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you next Monday evening at 7 right here on the Hamilton Report. Thank you, and good night.